What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be a very different albums ranking video to the previous ones that I've done on the channel. And this is going to be very different to what I usually do. I'm going to be doing a list on my top 10 favorite metal albums from the 2000s. Just something that I would like to do to spice some differences up when it comes to loads of these different album rankings and videos that have to do with albums in general. Now, there are going to be some honorable mentions before I start my top 10, and this is all very subjective and all on my own opinions. In no particular order, the albums that are in the honorable mentions are Trivium's Ascendancy, Behemoth with Demigod, Suns, Monoliths and Dimensions, and as well as that I would have included another favourite album from the 2000s, which was Iron Maiden's Brave New World. As much as I have loved these albums, there are so many that I would have put in my top 10, but these are my personal choices. And also, if you want to share your favourite metal albums from the 2000s down in the comments below, then feel free to do so. And number 10 is Machine Head's The Blackening. Now, as much as I have loved Machine Head for a very long time, this was always one of my favourite Machine Head albums. I loved this album. As soon as I was really becoming so obsessed with the band, I have loved another album from them being Under the Locust, which was one of my favourite albums from the 2010s. But this album, The Blackening, really does shine with its very aggressive and highly melodic, yet a distinction mark of musicianship and instrumentation. Some of the best powerful songs from the band, Clenching the Fists of Dissent to Aesthetics of Hate and Wolves to Halo, Now I Lay Thee Down. This whole entire album really showcases what Machine Head have really been capable of with a lot of these very tight and aggression-built riffs to some of the most manic drumming. And this was always one of the reasons why this album is one of my favourites from the 2000s. And this was very close of being my favourite Machine Head album overall. And I still love the band to this day. And I still think that this album is always one of the top very best albums in Machine Head's discography. Now, number 9, this is going to be a bit of a cheat for this one. At number 9 is Dope Smoker by Sleep. Now, I know that this album version right here is the Southern Lords 2012 reissue, but originally when it comes to the album with a Dope Smoker name, the album originally came out in 2003 via TP Records. So I decided to put this one in here because this is to me another one of these quintessential albums in the doom metal genre. Just a 1 hour long track on these really distorted, fuzzed, cranked up to the max chords all over with these various tempo changes and riffs, including some of Al's most howling vocals that really presents something very atmospheric and yet so thrilling with this album. Even this style of production from Dope Smoker sounds absolutely massive. It's just a very huge sounding metal album, and it's just always one of these albums that I would absolutely recommend to be included in the list as one of the most essential doom metal albums. So this is why this album is on the 9th spot. Number 8 is System of a Down's Toxicity. This album is one of my favourite albums of all time, and always to me, System of a Down's very best. A lot of these political charged lyricisms, including the police systems to the drugs, the government, and a lot of these very relevant lyricisms that stand out. But what really interested me so much about this album is just the overall music and the workaholic environment that System of a Down had been capable of for a very long time. This always has one of my big favourite System of a Down tracks of all time. Prison Song to Deer Dance, Atwa, also known as Air, Trees, Water and Animals, to toxicity and aerials. Even this production from Rick Rubin is, in my opinion, the best produced record he's ever done with the band. Darren Malakian's manic and frenetic rhythm guitar sections are just so addicting, and Serge Tankian's vocals are absolutely phenomenal on this record, as well as Shavo's thick bass lines to Jean Dalmayan's very rhythmic, versatile drumming patterns. And as much as I love System of a Down's discography, this album is just always one of those that I never ever get sick and tired of, because every track on here, including the musicianship, is just awesome perfection. Number 7 is Tool Lateralis. Now I know that some people would be upset for me to put this album at a pretty low ranking, but this is always one of those progressive metal albums that really has a very atmospheric journey surrounding this album, musically and instrumentally. And the only thing that I would say about this album in a little bit of a negative note is that some of the lengthy tracks can get into a little bit of a bloated feeling, but that does not take away what I love so much about this album. The incredible musicianship really works out, especially on some of these really deep and dark guitar riffs, to Danny Carey's creative drumming, and Maynard's vocals were just so out of this world on here. You can't go wrong with just the entire experience on this more than 70-minute album. Tracks like The Grudge to The Patient, and obviously with Schism to Lateralis, Parabola. Every track on the record follows each other in a masterful and a very adventurous way. Just some of the most complex, diverse and rhythmic structured albums that you'll ever hear. And no wonder this has been celebrated by many as one of the must-own albums in the progressive metal genre at the same time. And as well as just the wonderful production that works out so efficiently, that makes the sound of the band just as phenomenal. And as much as I have loved the albums from Anima and 10,000 Days, and even really liking and defending Fear Inoculum, Lateralis just always was the main favourite album in Tool's discography. Number 6 is Mutter by Ramstein. This album to me is no exception, and this was the album that really got me so obsessed with the band entirely. Every song follows each other very, very well, and I really got to love some of the albums of Sehnsucht to Reise Reise. Leben ist für alle da is one of my personal favourites, but this is the quintessential album from the band. Some of their most memorable hooks with their massively acclaimed popular singles of Sonne to Ich will, and some of the most amazing tracks, Mein Herz brennt to Rein Raus, Adios, the title track, Svita. Even the production for this album just sounds at their most precise and cleanest sound. The instrumental work on this album is just as a very memorable and just a fantastic versatility sound of what the band can really put out. This was just one of those albums that I was very addicted to, that it made me become a massive fan of Ramstein as a whole. So this is to me another standout album into the industrial metal genre as well. So that is Mutter by Ramstein as my personal favourite, and one of my very favourite albums from the 2000s. Number 5 is Annihilation of the Wicked by Nill. This was the album that got me into Nill as a whole. I remember seeing the music video of Sacrifice unto Sebek, which I was very unfamiliar with this technical death metal genre at the time when I was getting into metal music. But they've made some other amazing albums. You got Ithifalik to Those Whom the Gods Detest. As that this album has mainly my favourite Niall songs ever, like Sacrifice unto Sebek, but then you got the title track, Cast Down the Heretic, to Lashed to the Slave Stick, User Matre, and every song in between, just as some of the most frenetic, phenomenally powerful, and just such an absolute monster sound. This was the first album to have George on the drums, and he was a mental machine on the kit on this album, as well as the really distorting and a very aggressive sound from the rhythmic guitar sections and the chaotic guitar solos. This was always one of my favourite death metal albums of all time. If not, it could have been one of my top 3 favourite albums in the technical death metal genre. This was just as a perfection album, in my opinion, in their discography. So that's why Annihilation of the Wicked is at number 5. Number 4 is From Mars to Sirius by Gojira. Out of all of the albums that I have listened to from this band's discography, this album really takes the spot as my number 1 favourite in the band's discography. The very different lyricisms, a lot of it deal onto the environmental issues, to global warming, really just stands true to itself. And I know that the band have done that on occasional spots on earlier and later albums, but this is definitely dark to some of their most incredible stuff on this record. Ocean Planet to one of my other high favourites, From the Sky, and also one of the other strongest tracks, the title track, Global Warming, and the highlight on the album, which is Flying Whales. Joe's vocals on this album were just so awesome to hear some of his most aggressive vocal distortion, growls, and Mario's drumming, just one of the pinnacle monsters and masters of the modern metal drumming sound, and to me, one of the pioneers in this type of technical progressive death metal type of sound. And this production really has a very massive and a huge sound. And Gojira, with later albums, have done some outstanding production work that was just so fantastic, but this is to me their biggest acclaimed sound and quality of the music. Very favourite albums from the 2000s, especially in modern metal. So Gojira, From Mars to Sirius at number 4. Number 3, now this would be no surprise for a lot of you guys who are very familiar with me for the channel. I would have put this album at the top spot or at number 2, but the reason that I put this album at number 3 is that sometimes the albums above this, I do idolize this album for what it is, but I sometimes would like to explore some more of the diversity in production and the very big sound from the albums that are above this album's pick. And number 3 is Iowa by Slipknot. And this album to me is one of the staples in the new metal genre, and this is just a very relevant piece of metal art. And the version I got here is the 10th anniversary disc, special edition, and I know that I've got the original album on CD, but this album to me is one of the crowning achievements in the modern metal genre, and this is Slipknot at their most monstrous and heaviest peak. Just some of their violent, attacking, hateful, destructive vibes of nature, of lyricisms, politically and against humanity. This is to me like their biggest fuck you to everything in their paths. People Equal Shit to Disaster Piece, the Heretic Anthem, Gently to New Abortion, Skin Ticket, Metabolic. Corey's vocals on this album were just at his most, yet very aggressive, vocal breaking sounding performances, and as well as the instrumental sides go, as just an eruption of demonic and chaotic sound that Slipknot had ever put onto tape. And I will be doing an album review for this album, as I've mentioned about reviewing Slipknot's albums when Joey was credited in the band's history, but this is definitely one of their best produced as well, done by the master, that is Ross Robinson. There isn't really much I could personally say about this album, because I will save this album for my full in-depth review with 2 special guests, but this is just one of the most pinnacle metal albums from the decade, and that's why that I think this is a very relevant album in that decade alone. So that's why Iowa by Slipknot is at the number 3 pick. Number 2 is White Pony by Deathtones, and as much as I have loved the album that was Iowa, sometimes that I personally think that for differences in sound and music with a lot of the massive quality, Deathtones to me have released one album that is no exception, and White Pony is a very essential one for metal albums. And I have just played this album recently. This just sounds as polished and very dynamic, fresh sounding to this day, just like when it came out 20 plus years ago at this point. Terry Date's production was just as amazing. This has some of my most favourite Deathtones songs of all time. You've got Digital Bath to Knife Party, for me the main highlight on this album, to Pink Maggot, and of course with the single of Change in the House of Flies. Chino Moreno's vocals on here were just some of the softest, yet very dynamic driven, spookiest and melodic as well. And the guitar rhythm sections, some of the best riffs that Stephen had ever put out. It's just well executed. And as well as Abe Cunningham's drumming, this is to me their boldest and biggest sounding album in their discography. And also with the minimal looking album cover art, really sets the bar and the vibe of what's to come with the listening approaches with this album's experience. But I always admired this album, and the main number 1 pick as my favourite Deathtones album as well. So that's why White Pony is at the number 2 spot. At number 1, this album really is no surprise. This is just one of the most expected ones, but I have admired this album. This is an album that I am going to be doing a very full in-depth review of as well very soon this month. And this is my favourite album from the 2000s of all time. And that is Crack the Sky by Mastodon. No wonder that this album, for some of you that know me, picked this as my favourite Mastodon album. And as you can see, I got Bill Kelleher signature on the front cover. But I can really go on about this album. Everything from the majestic, beautiful artwork to the musicianship. This is where Mastodon, in my opinion, have really complete themselves with their very big craft as musicians. And this really does not have any dud whatsoever on this album. Even with the production done by Brendan O'Brien, his production sounded incredibly massive and just a wonderful full sound of Mastodon at their very best, in my opinion. Some of my favourite songs of all time from any band are on this. You've got Oblivion to Divinations, and to me the highlight of this album, The Last Baron, which really does fulfill this album's experience. Even the making of this album from this special edition perfects things with their experience on creating the album mentally and productively. But this album means the most to me as my favourite progressive metal album of all time, and to me this is the very definition chosen and pinnacle one in the prog metal genre, and this is always one of my favourites of all time, if not one of my top 10, and in my opinion this is why this is at number 1 as my favourite metal album of the 2000s. So Mastodon's Crack the Sky at the number 1 favourite album on metal in the 2000s. So that is it, guys. That is my list of my 10 favorite metal albums from the 2000s. I'm very interested to know what your album picks are in the comments down below, and tell me which albums are in your top 10, or if you're going to make a longer list, then very much feel free to do so, as that I would love to continue doing something like this. And I would like to do a lot more album rankings in any decade, because it really brings in a lot of the differences and the variety of what your album picks are from any decade. So I thought I'd start this little segment for this particular list. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.